I'm recording.
All right, I'm recording there, and we're doing War Champ.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the show. This is the BannedBooks podcast, Election 2020 special edition of the podcast. That way we can post it whenever we want.
Correct.
And it's not time bound or time stamped.
You can call it episode 180 if you want.
Let's call
What?
it episode 007.
It's 180.
Like it's
going to be 180. Sorry.
Oh, 180. Hey, that's nice. Episode 180.
Right. Let's do an about face here.
Cue the dad jokes. Yeah, exactly.
It's time to turn around, guys.
I say a pun. Can
we back up? Can we start over here?
No, I'm sorry. We've crossed that Rubicon. There's no going back.
That's true.
You can never cross the same river twice.
Well, so for example, if you were going to, since we're talking elections today, if you were going to try to do something different, is it possible to do that without a revolution? Something radically different, I would say.
I don't think when something is institutionalized, it's possible.
I mean, you can make small incremental changes, right?
Sure, but you're moving the deck chairs around, so to speak.
It's not going to be a significant enough change to really...
No, because the institution's primary purpose for existing is self-preservation. It's not going to allow itself to take that kind of a chance.
Right. We've talked about that. And that's true with parties too, of political parties.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. They can't...
I mean, let's be blunt. When we say party, we mean cult. I don't mean that in a purely pejorative sense. I mean that in a broad sense. Parties are cults. You can call them tribes. You can call them parties. You can call them teams. It's
everybody wear their hat.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Black suit or whatever it is. Black tie. Right. Black tie. That's it. Yeah.
To use sporting teams as an example, because when your favorite sports teams win, you riot. When your favorite sports team loses, you riot. So this election will be very akin to European football.
You think so?
100% in Minnesota, it's going to be that way. It's set up to be that way already. The Fed has already released information about different groups that are planning to attack people at the voting precincts and riot afterwards. Not like riot if one candidate or the other wins or loses, but just we're going to riot. Here's where we're meeting.
Yeah. Well, one might argue, and we'll see if this holds up over time, over the next week or so or more or months, that was the plan all along. Actually, is to create enough of a political catastrophe that then it's the excuse to actually bring about this large scale revolution or riot-based thing. I mean, because the groundwork's laid. You can go read the various organizations that have been set up and that have been active for the last 4 to 10 years. It seems like that's been the trajectory. It's like, well, we're not going to get what we want through normal political discourse and elections and lawsuits, or laws themselves. We're only going to get it if we destroy it all, burn it all down.
And this is true of you can study history. This is true of any regime throughout history. This goes back through the Germans in the 30s. This goes back to the Romans.
Right.
And even before that, is that the nature of the system, once it's become an institution, is self-preservation. And as we could probably argue, it doesn't matter how many parties you have. If they're all part of the same institution, they essentially become homogenous at a certain point. They just represent a different nuance or a different fold within the same fabric.
Right. Until, I'm thinking of Germany in the 30s, until you actually undermine the homogenous institution and create a power vacuum. And then you end up with, nationalists, the Nazis, and you end up with communists. The communists, which were the Antifa or whatever, the Russian influence in the same country. And it was like, okay, since we got this power vacuum, now we have to make a decision between either of these. Instead of saying, hey, you know what we had before was actually okay. It just needed a few tweaks here and there. We don't need to throw everything out, the baby with the bathwater. We could actually just kind of reform. But,
but that's not possible within that system.
You don't think so?
The people that are calling for reform are the ones, like in this case, Hitler and those who were with him at the beginning. They were spited by the aristocracy, by the politicians at Versailles at the conclusion of the First World War. The military didn't surrender, the politicians did.
So
And
they
the reason for
radicalized
that ultimate
Hitler. Is that
revolution
what
is
you're
because
saying?
the military came back to Germany and went, well, this isn't good. We're not going to let this stand. Because not
So,
only did you sign this peace treaty and allow them to come into our country and punish us
right,
severely, but then on top of that, you have a worldwide depression for
right.
different reasons. This is your fault too, then. You've destroyed
Mm,
everything that we fought for. And this is key. And I have a book that I recently bought about, it's called Two Who Survived, about two Jews,
right.
Eastern
Yeah, we've talked
European
about it on
Jews.
the show before, I think.
Yeah. And she talks about growing up in a rural village in Hungary. And all of these Jewish men are saying to the younger folks, they're not going to come for us. We fought in the war.
Hmm.
We're patriots. We fought on the side of Germany in the war. And then
Okay. Yeah,
and then
sure.
they came for them, of course, because they're Jewish and they don't care that you served in the war. But the identity following the First World War amongst those who were in Germany, and even then Hungarian Jews, for example, who fought on the side of Germany or Austria or wherever they came from, was like, that was pivotal, that moment. Like, I fought in the war. And what that signals is I'm on the side of those who are staging this revolution.
Yeah.
So it's not just a matter of politics, it's a matter of history. And we were wronged. And because we're wrong, this justifies what we're going to do. And if you're not down with the program, you're out. Because there's only
Yeah.
two sides. There's the good side, and then there's all of the enemies. But they had already earmarked most of those members of parliament as enemy after Versailles anyway. So they're already on the list
Yeah, I
to be
don't know
taken
this
out.
history well enough to really engage in it too much, except for
And
I
you
do
look
like
at
the, I,
Nero in Rome, it's the same thing. Nero was constantly vilifying subcultures, even Christians, and blaming them for his failures.
right, but we've also talked about, not on the show, but well, maybe we have in some context, but the idea of transference or,
Mhm.
this
Absolutely.
this kind of reflection is like the thing that they're criticizing is typically the thing they're guilty of
Yeah.
themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you say, well, you guys are fascists. Well, maybe, turn the mirror and see,
Yeah.
are you reflecting the same kind of behavior?
Right.
Or what was the one we were talking about yesterday in chat? Oh, what's called Trump derangement syndrome, TDS,
Right. Yeah.
right? And I was noting a famous atheist and kind of now supposedly thinking man. I say supposedly because he says, well, I reject Trump derangement syndrome, but you know what? Adolf Hitler and Osama bin Laden probably are actually better people than Donald Trump. And you're like,
Yeah. It makes total sense. That's
oh,
logical.
oh. I mean, on with what qualitative measure? I
I
mean, never
mean,
mind.
sure, his daughter's a converted Orthodox Jew and his son-in-law is a Jew, but absolutely. No,
Right, and
100%.
right. Well, but I think he was talking about like the character of the man, and you're still like, okay, based on character as well.
No.
Maybe he was thinking like, who would I rather have dinner with? But even on that, I would like, no,
Mm,
I'd go to a Trump hotel and have dinner with Trump. More than I would go
that'd
into
be
the
fascinating. Are you
I go
kidding me?
into
As
the
a character
mountain
study,
with.
that'd be fascinating.
Would you go in the mountain with Osama and have whatever he eats in the? It was just it was a very weird kind of statement for him to make because
Hmm.
you're saying that you're not deranged about this
Right.
man, and yet you will say something so superlatively
Yeah.
negative
Yeah.
that's beyond. And no one would actually agree. Well, maybe somebody would agree with you, but they would also be mad, you
Right.
know. And so it's driving us to kind of a madness, maybe that I think is
Well,
intentional. I think it's
it's a good,
intentional.
what you raised though, I think is a good side note of when logical people allow emotion to
Hmm.
drive their thinking, they still believe they're being rational because they're in a system. They exist in an
Mm,
intellectual academic system that allows them to believe that they are always rational because they're the professionals they've trained over years.
right,
They are not given to emotionalism. You see this with Sam Harris too.
right.
However, they say things like that and you realize, oh, your emotions may have atrophied from
Right.
lack of use, but you're allowing your emotion to determine and drive your verbiage.
Well, and I would say that reasonably they know their emotion. They just
Hmm.
don't know what's actually driving the emotion, right?
Sure.
What they're reacting to or why
Mhm.
they have that. Yeah. So think about oh, I don't know, like fear tactics, right? Like
Mhm.
you need to be afraid and you should be so afraid and I'll answer your fears and
Right.
maybe somehow.
Mhm.
And but you haven't actually told me why I'm afraid and you haven't
Right.
actually
Just be
said
afraid. Yeah.
you haven't said what you can actually do to set aside my fears, right?
Right.
It's like, oh, well, we're going to control a virus. That would be a statement that politicians make. Right?
Right.
Just pick your virus. It won't be COVID-19. In the far distant future, it will be what? COVID-21 or something, right?
COVID-21.
Or
Exactly.
whatever, right? Whatever the new, disease du jour is. And we can control it. You're like, well, how? Well, no, you can't ask that. You just need you need to trust me that I'm going to be able to control this so that you don't need to be afraid anymore.
It will probably definitely involve raising your taxes, though.
There's a government solution if there ever was one.
Oh, so much. It's like I was saying last week. Here's the perfect example of bureaucracy. I go to the post office to mail envelopes that have stickers in them. The postmistress informs me, well, the sorter bends these envelopes at a 45-degree angle. So if you want us to not bend your envelopes, they have to go through a special sorter, which is an extra charge. So then I look at her and say, so you are telling me that in order for you not to ruin my mail, which I pay you to do, I have to pay you extra to not ruin my mail? It's kind of like the mob coming around going, this is a nice store.
Yeah. Well, it's just like insurance.
To the ground.
You have to pay them not to lose your mail.
Right. I'm like, that's anybody who's like, we need more government programs. I'm like, go talk to the post office and then tell me how many programs we need.
I've wondered about this because I was thinking about like our candidates and then the whole, I've typically considered myself more libertarian with limits, if that's such a thing.
Libertarian with limits.
I have limits, right? I mean, I think I'm not an anarchist, which that would be a libertarian without limits. And
there you go.
Yeah. So, I mean, there is a place for law and rule. I guess limited government would be my thing. Like, don't give the government to do things that government can't do well. That's basically the limit. And is there a place for that? Because it doesn't seem like it's like everybody wants the government right now, like your candidate, for example, to fix some magically fix some problem. Like whatever you think the biggest problem is, whether it's COVID or whatever. And like, I don't think government has ever demonstrated an aptitude at these things. Really,
never. I mean, like, I know. Well, if I'm elected, I'm going to cure systemic racism. It's like, well, A, you haven't even defined what systemic racism is yet. B, you've been in politics for so long, aren't you the system? Like, you're literally a cog of the machine. Isn't
it incredible that you could point out something that, look, I mean, this country is what, 200, how many years old?
275 plus, yeah.
250 something, right? Is that right? Are we past 250 or are we not there yet? I don't know. I can't do the math.
Are we past 250?
2020 minus 1776, right? It would be 244. Yeah, we're not quite to 250. So wow, that'll be big. That'll be a big deal in 6 years. Okay. Anyway,
yes, it will, if we're still here in 6 years.
244 years, and only in the last decade or less, we've discovered that we never actually, noticed that at the beginning it was a racist country. Like, actually, I think we did. There, I mean, the civil rights movement, but even before that, I mean, Lincoln,
well, we had
emancipation of the slaves,
and there were a few people.
I think we've recognized it. I think, but nobody has claimed that it's been solved either.
Right.
And
well, now we got to raise the stakes.
Well, and I made a comment. I think, was it on the show already, or was it before we went on air? I can't even remember now. I don't. What day is it?
Flows together.
Is there an election tomorrow? I don't know. No, we were talking about the only way that you can understand how how a politician acts is to have a very robust understanding of original sin, right?
Right. Yeah.
And so you look and you're like, oh, politicians keep trying to fix a problem, but they're inherently flawed themselves.
They created,
and they create their own. They create new problems by trying to solve old problems
for us. Right.
Yeah. That's kind of the nature of politics. I mean, it's not it can't be a static thing. There is no, city on a hill or all the religious ideology that's sometimes attached, right? Like England said, well, hey, we're the new Jerusalem. And you're like, I don't think that's what the Bible was talking about.
No, probably not.
And you don't want to be in England right now either. They're under 4-week lockdown. So
4 weeks to flatten the curve.
Another 4-week lockdown. I'm sorry.
Shout out to everybody in England. Get out,
or
run,
or Ireland or Australia. Where are you going to run to? Those are islands.
Known as the future lab for pharmaceutical companies to test their vaccines.
Isn't that something?
Again, the Irish are a good example. I have a friend who's native Navajo, and
Hmm.
he's got a great attitude because, again, growing up in that Navajo culture, they have a long history of like, oh yeah, no, we know exactly what happens when the government comes around asking us to do stuff.
Yeah.
My friend in Ireland's the exact same way. Whereas
They don't
like, oh
forget.
no, the
No.
Irish have a very long history of what the British like to do to us.
Well, and I think this is important too as we talk about politics, in that I've been thinking about it. Like, I mean, we remember the Cold War, you and I. We were at the tail end of it, but enough
I
that
would
we
say
remember.
we were at the most apocalyptic part of it.
Almost, yeah, probably. I mean,
Late
it was
70s,
either
early 80s. It was crazy.
everything was going to blow up, or
Mhm.
we'd get through it, and we did get through it, which was beautiful.
Well, we lived through Chernobyl.
That's
That's
true.
the thing.
Yeah.
You know, there's 3 Mile Island, and then that was when I was in elementary school, and then when I was in high school, that's Chernobyl.
But Chernobyl, I mean, really just showed us I mean, it wasn't nuclear warfare, but it showed us what would happen.
Right. That's what I'm saying. It's like
Yeah.
everyone's like, oh, oops. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's pretty significant. But we remember the Cold War, but you think like, you only have to be a couple of years younger than us, and now you don't even remember Cold War. There's people who
Right.
are voting that weren't there when the Twin
No.
Towers fell, you know,
Right.
which is pretty incredible. Like
Yeah.
that they have no knowledge, especially because of the way we're not in a. You mentioned the Navajo, but I mean, for the most part, we're not a historic
No,
culture.
we're an ahistoric civilization at this point.
Right, exactly. We don't know our history.
Scholars have written about the end of history in the United States in the late 20th century and the move toward that ahistorical context, which
Well, it was like that video I sent you that, I mean, I didn't agree with everything he said, but he titled it the Irish Gulag
yeah,
Archipelago.
right. Yep.
And I'm like, how many people have read Gulag Archipelago? You know,
Not
I mean,
many.
the only reason I even know of it is Jordan Peterson,
Yeah, right.
who pointed, you know, wrote the preface and pointed back to it. Like, you
Right.
have to read this. And it's
Right.
essential reading. It's part of the curriculum in Russia.
Yeah.
So everybody reads it. Like, really?
Which is ironic considering who's ruling Russia.
I know. But if we're ahistoric, if we don't actually know our history, we can't actually act with wisdom.
Right.
You know, because we're not going to learn from mistakes because we don't even know our mistakes.
Right.
And it seems to me in particular, this like, let's burn everything down and start over again is like there's 20th century examples of how well that goes. Or you could go back to the French Enlightenment, which is actually really relevant, since a lot of what we learned went wrong with the French Enlightenment reflects on what we did here with the revolution here. Right. But I mean, our country
the
was
French
founded with the
actually
revolution.
currently are not reflecting on their history, and therefore there's some significant social and civil unrest in France.
Yeah. Yeah, because what were the three things? Fraternity, liberty, and egalitarian, or equality. Those were the three,
Equality.
like, yeah, that it was whatever the French version of egalitarian is. It sounds like it. I can't speak French, sorry, French speakers. But those were the three principles, and you're like, oh, but we're gonna make a French Islam. Way to go, Marcon, right?
Yeah, that's gonna work. Because the tenets of the French Enlightenment and Islam, they dovetail so well together.
It's like, oh my gosh, what's gonna happen? Anyway,
it's like those fail videos where the ocean liner isn't stopping and it just crashes right into the pier. And everyone's standing around with their phones out. I wonder what's going to happen. And everyone starts screaming.
So we're running headlong into something that we don't understand, and we don't know what's going to happen.
Well, it's the beginning of the 21st century. And if you look at the beginning of the 20th century, this was happening at the exact same time. Go back and look at 1920. What was happening?
True.
In the United States.
Yeah, true.
There was communism, there was anarchism, there was Nazism, there was socialism, and there was political unrest, and there was a worldwide thing that was about to happen.
It's almost like there is a century cycle.
It almost seems that way because you go back another century and it's very similar at the turn of the 19th century.
Right. Yeah.
And that's at least for myself, that's the way I look at it, is rather than go play the Hitler card, for example, which is not even emotive at this point. It's just a self-parody when someone's
it's
like,
lazy.
You're Hitler.
It's really lazy.
It is. Come on, dude. Like, have you even read Mein Kampf at this point?
You might actually agree with a lot of it if you read it.
I look at it that way. I've gone back and restudied 1900 to 1930, and then went back and studied 1800 to 1830. and looked at that and went, well, at the beginning of these centuries, are there trends? Are there similarities? Are there differences? Is it purely the technology that allows us to arrive at this state? I mean, the interesting thing is at the beginning of the 20th century, very apocalyptic. Beginning of the 1800s, very apocalyptic. You just keep going back. Beginning of the 1500s, very apocalyptic. There's something about there's something about the turn of that calendar
of the century,
and the century, but yet, like at the end of the Middle Ages, going into the 1500s, you had the end of feudalism and the rise of what would eventually become capitalism, and how upsetting that was to those institutions. And Luther was a part of that.
Yeah, that's true.
And you go back, and then the beginning of the 1600s and the 30 Years' War, and then the 1800s, and then the 1900s. There's social unrest, there's civil unrest, there's technological innovation and change.
Yeah.
Institutions are falling. You look at the history of the rise of John D. Rockefeller, for example, and he was just there at the right moment, in the right place, at the right time, and made decisions that other people wouldn't make. And then he just kind of rode that wave of success. And yet there are so many other factors that had to happen simultaneously for him to be successful in that endeavor. And yet we have Standard Oil.
Yeah. I wonder how much of this
But now we're moving into the 21st century in the fourth industrial revolution. And now we're moving away from the third industrial revolution, the industrial revolution type of stuff, into AI,
the so-called fourth. Yeah, the so-called.
I'm sorry, so-called fourth industrial revolution, according to the World Economic Forum and NATO and the Vatican.
The people who define such things, yes.
Right. But that's the drive now, is to say, okay, it's time for another revolution. It's time for another industrial revolution. In order to do that, I'm going to have to destroy 46% of the world economy, because those people are no longer, quote unquote, essential, because this new revolution requires new training. Reskilling is what they talk about on the website. We need to reskill people.
Yeah. I'm going to link it up here.
Okay. But the point is, whether it's whatever the motives are, there are people that recognize, and there's social events that happen that form this conflagration of events and people that come and go, okay, here's the direction this is going to go. And it's violent. Yeah. Because you're essentially saying to an institution like the Roman Catholic Church, it's existed for 1,000 years. And then a guy comes along and says, no, I disagree. We need to go in a different direction.
Yeah.
And then it has a certain momentum and then some inertia to it. And eventually you get the Frederick the Wises to jump on board and basically protect you and allow that to happen. And then it unfolds with the Peasants' Revolt and the Augsburg Interim and Schmalkald, and on and on it goes. But it's always then going to be difficult because you're a part of that institution, whether you realize it or not. Over COVID, Amazon made record profits. And
so did Apple, Google, Zoom.
But I'm using Amazon as an example because we refuse to wear masks. My family, we refuse to wear masks into businesses. So we don't go to certain businesses because they won't allow us to be in the store without masks on. So Amazon gets our business. Target curbside pickup gets our business. And so do you compromise in order to get into these businesses, or do you stick with your principles and say, no, I refuse to become a part of this system because of these reasons, and therefore I will not perpetuate this hoax, and I'm not going to wear your mask. I'm free. Well, then you can't come in here. Okay, well, I can get my stuff elsewhere, which plays into then the shift away from brick and mortar shopping to online shopping. It's subtle. It's benign.
Well, and that's why you said,
benign, but it's not.
We can't talk about agendas, but I think we have to. And the problem is that agendas, I mean, those reside in the heart, and in institutions, they're not always explicit.
Right. Sometimes, it's not always in the contract when you come to work there. Right. Here's the guidelines and rules, and this is how we run our company.
Right. Exactly. Or here, it used to be like Google, and for example, was don't be evil, right? And that was kind of their agenda. But whatever that meant, I mean, it's such an amorphous thing to say. Define evil for me. We redefine evil all the time to decide what we're going to do. Yeah. Right. So I think agenda does matter. And so what is the agenda with these 100-year revolts and whatever? It does seem to be a little bit of apathy, also a little just discontentment. But there also just seems to be opportunity to take advantage of this like, well, something's going to happen feeling
right.
that's in the culture,
Right.
and then utilize that to pull, you know, a power play,
So
basically.
let's take something more practical and then segue into what we're going to read today, which is we both now, you are further along than I am, but we both have our own business. And
Right.
so you and I have to do all of the work to make the business a success if we want it to be successful. We have to design the infrastructure, we have to design the marketing, we have to design every aspect of it because it's our business. We're
Right.
entrepreneurs. So let's say you and I are both successful in getting a business started, and at a certain point, it gets to that point where you're like, I gotta have somebody else to help me because there's too much work. Now, that person that you hire, you bring that person in, you train them personally, so they are going to be as close to where you're at in your own head as far as running the business as can be, because it's coming straight from you. This is how I do this. This is why I do this. This is how I want you to do this.
Might even be like a family member, so then they're really
Could even be
close.
a family member, exactly. So
Yeah.
they're going to carry that forward. But at a certain point, the business grows to the extent that the people are just being plugged into a system that already exists. It's essentially self-perpetuating at that moment. Show up, do it. And the machines will take care of this for you, and this machine does this, and this person does that. So
Right.
now, instead of Chris Gillespie or David Riley being responsible for bookkeeping, advertising, everything, now I have somebody who does bookkeeping. I have somebody in marketing. I have somebody who is in charge of just t-shirts, and somebody who's just in charge of packaging. And if they aren't able to do the job or they quit, we just hire somebody else and they plop them right back in there. And at a certain point, this is like with Jack Dorsey and Twitter. How much does
Right.
Jack actually know about what's happening day to day within the institution that is Twitter?
Well, I
Probably
think
not a lot.
based on his testimony, he's pretty
Nothing.
high most of the time, and he
I
doesn't
was
even
gonna say,
know who
based on
he
his
is.
testimony,
Eh,
please, for the love of God, Jack, eat a steak. Like, eat a steak, eat several steaks, get some iron in you. And second of all, yeah, pull way back on the cannabis usage. Just saying.
Well, I think it's magic mushrooms, but anyway,
Well, it's a lot of stuff. Let's just put it this way. I
he's
think it's more than
microdosing, right?
there's some he's microdosing for sure, but there's some Adderall in there too. The point is though that you start and it's just you, or
Yeah.
it's you and one other partner or whatever, right? But it's very tight. And then as it grows, it becomes, again, the institutional part of what we're discussing, and that's why I'm using this example is an institution is almost organically self-preserving at a certain point. You just reach a certain point where the people become an organism.
Right. And then the
And
founders get run off.
right.
When it finally takes on its own life, then
Exactly.
then you're like, you know what? You guys need to quietly retire.
Actually,
We know that.
Yeah. George Hegel talked about this. Georg Hegel, the philosopher, he actually called it the unimind, basically. But basically, what he was trying to explain is like, how can he was talking about natural law essentially. Like, how can someone in China and someone in Brazil and someone in the United States all have the exact same spiritual revelation of, hey, there's a God, or that we should all join together to build a better world, these kinds of things. And so he was trying to figure out like how, and we would call that the logos is what he's reflecting on, this kind of like universal oneness that we're all being pulled into, which he called God. That's why he used the example, and I use the example in this way. That's why if you're all watching the same sporting event and someone scores a touchdown, you all stand up simultaneously. No one told you to stand up. No one told you to scream, but you all do it simultaneously. Some of that is learned because you see other people doing it. But then in the moment, what Hegel is saying is like, in that moment, we're all one spirit. We are all sharing in one logos, one mind, one reality.
I mentioned that in church on Sunday. Like when you sing together, your heart ends up beating in sync with each other.
Yeah, right. You know, you know this, when you have morning devotions and you read a psalm or you pray in the same cadence. You're breathing the same way.
Well, maybe not at first, but you fall right into it eventually.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And what you learn is whoever is leading, that would be the pastor in this case, everyone else breathes in relation to how the pastor is reading.
Unless the guy like has no ability to speak out loud.
There's that. But then when it comes to a political party or a cultist of any sort, religious, earthly, whatever it might be, at the beginning, you have the true believers. You have the ones who are setting down the rules and creating the boundaries and saying, this is how this works. But at a certain point, it does become this organism, this entity that kind of seems like it has its own mind. It kind of lives and breathes on its own, even though it's people that are making that institution concrete and real. But those people aren't thinking anymore. This is finally my point, is that you and I are thinking constantly. How do I improve my business? How do I get people to sign up? How do I sell the product? What do I do to advertise? How do I design the shirt? We're always thinking. But at a certain point, if you open up a coffee shop or a roastery, but then you expand that to include 50, 100, 300 employees, there's no thinking required anymore. There's just plug in, pull the lever, go.
Well, it becomes something different as well. I think that's important to note.
Well, there's no passion.
But here's an example. Like if I ask you, what is Kodak? Who is Kodak? You'd be like, well, they're the people who made the cameras, and then they got into, they do photography. And you're like, no, that company's gone. Yeah, Kodak is a pharmaceutical company in Puerto Rico that Trump gave a bunch of money to.
Yeah, exactly.
You're like, what? That's not Kodak. It's like, why would you restart Kodak as a pharmaceutical company? That's a pretty big pivot.
Yeah, it is a big pivot.
It's like, was there even a company left that could pivot? I guess there must have been. But
there was somebody there that went, hey guys, hear me out. Got an idea.
Well, I guess they know something about chemicals. I don't know. It's just it's a weird thing. But companies do pivot that way. What would be another one? General Electric's that way, right? They were making big engines, but now they're mostly like medical equipment, I think. Yeah. So they change. I think companies change, I guess. They have to, otherwise the mom and pop businesses that like, hold their ground and say, we're not going to grow, we're not going to be, and then it's 1 or 2 generations and then it's gone.
Right.
Yeah. That's where the farms went, by the way.
And that's why ultimately, I think it's not cynical, at least not theologically speaking, it's not cynical that you have a very low anthropology when you enter into an interface with these organizations and these institutions, because they don't care about you, because that's not the nature of the institution. Institutions are not, empathetic.
No, and they resist change.
They
resist control.
Right.
And then
which is why ultimately they sow the seeds of their own destruction.
In the end, yeah.
In the end, they do, because the people that are hired are not hired for their passion; they're hired for their ability to pull a lever.
Right. Or in the case of a political party, to raise money.
To raise money, exactly. And therefore, the more money you raise for the candidate, the more they're going to be willing to just talk to you.
I think we're up to or close to $2 billion spent on political ads this year.
That's
isn't that incredible?
That's amazing. If you watch YouTube enough, as much as I do, I'm to the point I will pay you to stop advertising to me.
You can pay Google, but now you're paying Google.
Right.
It's like, okay, now this is an impossible ethical choice. Do I pay Google money so I don't watch ads, or do I keep watching the ads
so I don't pay Google money, which then generates money for Google? Yeah, you lose.
Oh, you already lost if you're on there. Okay.
Yeah, that's how you got to play the game. The game is they wrote the rules and they designed the game, and you're not even really allowed to play. You're more of a piece on the board. You're Vermont Avenue.
Nice.
You're not even an important piece.
Vermont.
That's why when you play Monopoly nowadays with your kids, for example, it's great because they're like, Dad, why are you buying all this cheap property? And you're like, just wait. And then they get to Park Place or something. They're like, I got Park Place. I'm like, you are adorable. And then of course, 3/4 of the way through the game, they're broke because I developed all the cheap property and I'm a true capitalist.
You know how to play the game. That's right.
You gotta know how to play the game, son. That being said, then, when it comes to politics and religion, one, it's a lie that we separate church and state in this country. It's a lie, at least practically speaking. It's like saying, well, there's 3 things that you don't talk about in polite company: sex, religion, and politics.
Yeah.
That's all we talk about. That's all we talk about.
I sent you an article from our church body's president.
Yeah, right.
Matthew Harrison. It was from 2016. So it was during the primary season of 2016. So in March. And he put a stat in there: 95% of pastors in our church body are registered Republicans.
Shocking.
I know.
Shocking.
Right. But it's like the fact that they know that tells you, oh yes, politics and, church politics, they do intersect pretty strongly.
And you and I have heard this locally. We've heard this from people that listen to the show. We've heard this from peers and colleagues as well, that people will not come to church if they hear you preaching a political agenda from the pulpit or teaching a political agenda from the lectern. That being said, because I definitely, for certain, can speaking for myself, was up until extremely recently very, very, very resistant to that.
Yeah, me too.
Saying that it ain't happening. It's not happening.
I'm not saying I didn't want to, but yeah, I
wanted to
back.
for sure, but I wanted to stay clear of it because pastorally, I don't want people to get confused and think, well, he's Democrat, he's Republican, he's this, he's that. But then, yeah, recent events in the past 8 months or so have compelled me to change my stance on that.
Right, but I think
got to preach the law.
I was going to say we're universally critical. I hope. I mean, I think there's probably more to criticize of one party over the other in general.
Well, put it this way: I hate communists. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah, exactly.
I hate communists, and I mean that in the strongest possible sense because they're godless.
Or the soft communism called socialism.
I don't hate them. I just question their knowledge base.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And and have you interfaced enough with the rest of the world to comprehend what this actually looks like? Because again, you read about it, you listen to people at your university or at your school talk about it, but have you actually been to an actual country or talked with someone from an actual country,
right?
Where it's like a guy I know, his family escaped from Cuba, and he was talking about his aunt and saying like her life was so good back in Cuba that she walked through a minefield in order to get arrested at Guantanamo Bay, in the hope that they would extradite her to the United States and give her political asylum. That's how good she had it back home.
That's literally, that whole statement, I'll crawl over broken glass, to vote in this election. Yeah.
She literally had one of her breasts blown off by a landmine to get out of Cuba. And then her kids grow up and go to college and say, well, but that's not real socialism. She's like, well, it felt really real to me standing in line for 3 days to get rice.
Kids, good night.
But that's the problem. Like I said, with any institution, even that institution, even one generation removed from the event, you weren't there, you didn't experience it. I've talked about this in relation to my great grandma and the Depression. I could not figure out why that crazy old woman carried so much stuff around in her sweater pockets. And then I lived in a third world country and went, oh, I understand now. I understand.
You got it.
Yeah. So what I'm saying is, before you decide to become a socialist or a communist, please join the Peace Corps or become a missionary, and please travel not to a third world country, but to a third world socialist run country.
Well, you can't travel right now, so good luck.
There's that. Join the resistance. Get smuggled into the country inside of a car.
But there's a border wall now. How am I supposed to do that?
Come on, kids. Do I have to do everything for you?
Get creative.
Problem. This is the problem with public education.
Watch a movie or something.
So in the church, then, we are, at least in our church tradition, in the Lutheran Reformation tradition, we do not overlap or mix together the secular and the spiritual kingdoms, the kingdom of Christ and the kingdom of this world. However, we do hold them in tension because they overlap the cross, because Jesus is fully God and fully man. He is fully of this earth and yet fully of heaven.
He died to redeem you from this world.
Yeah, and we are sent into our vocations by God to serve and love our neighbor. Being a pastor is a vocation. I'm called to serve and love my neighbor. And thank God in heaven there's no pastors. But that means then that I do have to preach the law lawfully. And politics is the area, that's the sphere of law. It literally involves laws.
I pointed that out to my Bible study on Sunday. I said, the Supreme Court building has 10 Commandments famously engraved on it, right? But it doesn't have a cross, a crucifix with Jesus dead on it.
Which is a good sign then that going into that building, you should not expect the gospel.
You don't expect pardon.
No.
Forgiveness.
No. Right.
No.
Exactly.
For your offenses.
So at least, and you and I have both, we were talking about this before we hit record too, is that really in the United States, especially since the Second World War, the distinction has melted away to a certain extent. The dichotomy of it, the tension has been resolved for lots of folks. One way or the other.
Yeah.
So you end up with kind of kingdom of heaven on earth kind of mentality. Like, well, if you vote for this politician or if you are down with this program, we're closer to the kingdom than we used to be. Or you actually confuse a politician with a savior.
Yeah. Well, and that ideology is on both sides of the aisle.
It is 100%.
It was hope and change That was the before.
Yep, that's
with
right.
President Obama, and now it's like make America great again. It's like it's kind of like I said, this shining city on the hill, and maybe I'm not. I think you can be hopeful, but you just but restrained in that hope, recognizing that it's always there's never perfection.
I mean,
right?
are we talking like Last of the Mohicans great again, or Doctor Strangelove great again? Like, what generation are we referring to?
Well, it's an imaginary great again, right?
Of course it is.
The one that you remember so fondly, but that you didn't actually experience.
Right.
It's like, what?
Ain't that the truth?
Yeah, your memory's faulty. Sorry, people.
Yeah. So somebody made the joke again the other day to me. They're like, you were born in the wrong time. I'm like, what do you mean? They're like, you should have definitely been around during the Old West or when Vikings were raiding. I'm like, yeah, that'd be awesome, except for the whole reality of having to live there. And
that was pretty awesome. I mean,
literally just watched a documentary about the Norsemen and some of the genetic defects they passed down to their progeny.
Well, it's kind of like how we look with fondness on like punk rock, and you're like, you know, it really most of it.
It was gross.
It was
super
gross. Yeah, or grunge music be another example. Like grunge. I mean, most of it was pretty terrible. There was a few examples that kind of hold up.
Terrible. I was there. I dressed.
Right? Yeah, but maybe that's the reality of nostalgia, isn't it? Though, right?
You can kind of pick and choose.
It's like
the best bits.
Wasn't it great wearing flannel? Not really.
Around your
warm.
waist.
Flannel around your waist. Oh no.
With your shorts and your combat boots and your socks pulled up.
Your Doc Martens. Yeah.
I couldn't. I had actual combat boots from the Army surplus store because I was.
You couldn't
authentic.
Use English boots.
You had to be authentic. You can wear Doc Martens. That was so elitist. But it's true because you want to be nostalgic for something like that as an example. But actually, I just watched Bad Season concert this morning, of all things.
There you go.
With Lane Staley and Mark Lanigan, and because Lane's
they're dead.
Of that. Well, Lanigan's alive, but Lane died and was alone in his apartment for 2 weeks before anyone found his body. He overdosed on heroin.
Right. Yeah.
My favorite people all died of drug overdoses from that generation, or shot themselves in the face, allegedly. Courtney Love, I'm looking at you.
Well, I got into jam bands, right? And so it was all this like nostalgic view of hippies, right? Like,
please don't say it.
You're gonna wear your sandals and
don't say the one band.
What starts with a P and an H?
Oh, yeah.
I still enjoy it.
Stevie Ray Vaughan crashes into a hill in Wisconsin, but Fish is still touring. That's all I'm saying.
Well, who said there was justice in this world?
There is no justice.
To that point.
I'm in a dark place now. Okay, here we go. Calm Blue Oceans. Calm Blue Oceans. So we're going to dive into this. This is actually from the book. I'll hold the book up for people to see on the video.
Yeah, there you go.
It's called Tyranny and Resistance, the Magdeburg Confession and the Lutheran Tradition by David Mark Whitford. It's a shorter book. It is actually not even quite 100 pages, so it's actually shorter than my book.
Nice.
And but Mark's really good at covering the second generation Lutheran reformers, Flacius, the guys, Andreas, and guys that wrote the Formula of Concord in our Lutheran confessions.
He teaches Reformation studies at Baylor, certainly.
Is he at Baylor now?
Yeah, and he has his PhD from Boston University.
Yeah.
But yeah, the list of works here and articles, it is definitely second generation. Landgrave, the Landgrave.
Mark Edwards is another one. Mark Edwards wrote Luther and the False Brethren, Luther's Last Battles, that kind of stuff. And the second generation of the Lutheran Reformation is kind of a lost generation.
Yeah,
cover it a lot. There's not a lot written about it.
Well, it's probably because we don't like it.
It's pretty pedantic,
and it's also messy.
To use a G.K. Chesterton term, it got really pedantic and it got ugly.
Right.
Ugly.
It's a lot easier to talk, Luther and Melanchthon, and okay, and they're kind of polars, and
if
they're
you
complementary.
think that the debates between Luther and Melanchthon were ugly, multiply that times like 10. And then you get to the formula.
Well, because they're also arguing with the Reformed.
Yes, for, against, they're being infiltrated by the Reformed.
Yeah, right. A little bit of everything.
Like communism in the 50s. It's like, yeah, some of those guys weren't communists, but you know what? A lot of them were actually.
So he's been at Baylor since 2013.
Had his demons. McCarthy, out of his mind, but he was also right about a lot of them.
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah. Same thing with Wittenberg. Then is that they're like, hey, there's Reformed people infiltrating the faculty under the guise of being Lutheran. Yeah, a lot of them actually were Calvinists. They were Reformed.
Nothing new
Some
under
of
the
them were
sun.
Lutheran. What's that?
I said there's nothing new under the sun.
Nothing new under the sun. To which are you alluding, Pastor Gillespie?
Oh, I don't know. What did we call him? Pseudo-Calvinist? No, not pseudo-Calvinist. Something Calvinisticum, wasn't it? In the Latin? I can't remember what the word is.
Yeah.
But the hidden Calvinist.
Crypto-Calvinist, I'm sorry.
Crypto, there you go.
Crypto-Calvinist.
Like cryptocurrency, right?
Yeah.
It's not really
Well,
currency.
it's crypto-Calvinists, they get together and they kind of build like a fort in the university. And as a consequence, it kind of spreads from there.
Oh, you mean a party?
Fort into the rest of the church.
A cult? A party?
Almost.
Oh, look at that.
But we digress.
We do.
From the moment that Constantine converted to Christianity and conscripted his armies into the church to win a decisive battle, the church and the state have existed in an often unhealthy tension. I like that. That's a nice sentence.
That's true.
That is how you start a section. That is rich. I like that. Each tried to wield power, church and state. Each tried to wield power and influence in the other's sphere. Thus, the Holy Roman Empire. At Canossa, in 1077, the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire was made to wait in the snow, pleading for absolution from Pope Gregory VII. In 1533, Henry VIII of England, by act of parliament, pronounced himself supreme head of the church. That's great.
Yeah.
We know that.
Well, and I brought this up in
It's like a martial arts teacher who promotes himself to a higher belt.
That's right. Or gives himself a special title. Oh, I was listening to a political rally yesterday, and he's like, well, this guy, he calls himself the supreme leader. He just calls himself that. He's not really the supreme leader. But that's what he wants to be called. So I call him the supreme leader because that's what he wants to be called. Like, that's hilarious.
Who's it hurt? Come on now.
All right, supreme leader of what? I mean, it doesn't really matter.
You think you could pull that off at home? Don't call me dad. Call me supreme leader.
Now, the important thing here in this paragraph is that until fairly recently, there was not much of a distinction between church and state.
No, and not really an attempt.
No, they saw the two as intertwined. And really, if you read the Bible, and you're looking for a definitive doctrine of politics, if you like, you don't find one because they're kings and they're judges and they're Caesars who demand worship. And you're like, well, I thought he was the king. Well, kind of a king or emperor.
He's a king,
but he's also God. Or Pharaoh is another good example, right?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, no, he demands worship as well.
I've brought this up before. There's a book called The King's Two Bodies about medieval kings and the theology of monarchies. And yeah, the earthly king represents the spiritual king. He has two bodies, two heads.
He is a vicar of Christ in a way.
Yeah, he is, because why is he the king? And why has he been ordained by the Holy Roman See to be king?
They kept anointing kings, didn't they?
Earth. Yes, they did.
So it's fairly,
it wasn't until the French Revolution, essentially, that they're like, this isn't working.
Let's break these things apart. Yeah.
Let's make a whole bunch of little kings who are also simultaneously all little gods.
Right. Or let's make reason a god.
Let's make reason a god, because then we can all be gods in our own minds.
We can worship reasonable things. Okay.
Right. That worked out for the best.
So much sarcasm.
I know, right? So in Divine and Human Authority in Reformation Thought, Ralph Keane outlines three broad approaches within the Reformation to the relationship between the secular world and the spiritual. Inclusively ecclesial, exclusively biblical, and inclusively biblical. So again, to repeat that, inclusively ecclesial, inclusive, not exclusive, inclusively ecclesial, exclusively biblical, and inclusively biblical.
So we'll break those down.
Yeah. So Hildebrand at Canossa characterizes an inclusively ecclesial perspective. Authority for the governance of creation is found by God in the church. God's authority flows to the church, especially the Pope. The church then yields some of that authority to the emperor, to the earthly authorities.
Okay.
But it's church and then emperor.
Through the church, right?
Through the church.
To the state.
Yes. As far back as Pope Leo's bold move to crown Charlemagne emperor of the Romans in AD 800, Leo began the establishment of papal supremacy over secular authority. How this works is Charlemagne had an army and the Pope had money.
Yeah.
The Pope needed an army and Charlemagne needed money.
And I think Leo in particular, what was his doctrine? It was the doctrine of two swords. This is it's right at the time of Leo, which said that he wielded two swords. He had secular authority and spiritual authority, right? As head of the church. And basically, I mean, I don't know how you get to this without denying Jesus' own word when he says to Pilate, my kingdom is not of this world. If it were, I would have,
That's why it's inclusively ecclesial.
Right. So his authority is over the church, but does the church have authority over the world?
Right.
That's the question.
Well, and I always ask this question too, reflecting on history, and we were talking about Cyrus the Great by Xenophon before this. Cyrus, just like the king that Cyrus replaces, are assumed to be divine, at least in some aspect. They are either the manifestation of divinity, they are an avatar or an instrument of divinity. They speak on behalf of divinity, but the ruler is the ruler, theologically speaking, in many different cultures, because the gods or God has chosen them to be their earthly representative. The fact that medieval Catholicism was essentially doing the same thing as, let's say, the Persians, which happened 2,000 years previous to this, should give us pause and cause us to at least ask, okay, is this a biblical doctrine? Or are we just lifting this from other sources? Which, again, there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not saying that an earthly form of governance is right or wrong because it doesn't necessarily agree with the biblical, like you said. I think you and I would both say, and we're going to get to this in the definitions, there's no biblical definition of like, this is the best way to rule. Maybe judges.
And I'm not even necessarily opposed to a state that has a, kind of a confession of faith attached to it. I mean, we've had plenty of those, and there were plenty of Lutheran, provinces and territories and countries, or Catholic or Reformed or whatever. Although it does seem to confuse matters, right? Because then citizenry is attached to baptism, and that's not really what baptism is. Not giving earthly citizenry.
Right? Yeah. If you're baptized, you're a German, and therefore you're a Lutheran, or if you're Spanish and you're baptized, you're Roman Catholic.
Right. And then, our church body was founded by people who came for cheap farmland, I would say predominantly, but also because the religious atmosphere in Prussia was terrible, because it was a mixture.
It was a off. That's what my mom king came from that.
Yeah, the king was Lutheran and his wife was Reformed, and it's like, well, what are we going to do here? Oh, I got it. Right. Let's just blend the two. Well, that always goes well.
Yeah.
Because it's neither Reformed nor Lutheran anymore. It's like, like Christianity trying to affect rock and roll.
Yeah.
It makes it all worse.
So that's the first one. So then the radical reformers developed an alternative approach. And the word radical from the word radix in Latin means root.
Right.
And the accusation against Luther, for example, was that he didn't go far enough.
He only was trimming the branches instead of getting to the root of it. Yeah.
We got to get to the roots of the true biblical faith, or true biblical governance in this case.
Or uproot it, really, right?
Yeah. This goes back to your earlier question about, can you have a revolution that's not violent? In the exclusively biblical model, the church must conform to the gospel explicitly. Again, the church must conform to the gospel explicitly.
What do they mean by gospel? Yeah.
Exactly. No deviation is allowed. Well, Jesus is a lawgiver, of course. The relationship between the secular and the spiritual is antagonistic. This antagonism seems to elicit two responses: withdrawal or usurpation, which I just read about from the Book of the Samurai yesterday in the Warrior Priest podcast, is that withdrawal from the company of other peoples is a sign of cowardice, actually.
Right. So name two groups that would match this. So withdrawal would be what, like Mennonite or Amish?
Any Anabaptist group.
Any Anabaptist. Usurpation would be like Calvin's Geneva.
Yeah. A secular monastic rule.
We're going to take over the government. The church is going to take it over. Yeah.
Right. So in many Anabaptist groups, which you named some, the church withdrew from secular society and placed itself over and against the dominant culture. One of the most remarkable things I think I've seen in the last month, and I've seen a lot of remarkable things, was going on YouTube and seeing Amish people showing up for a Trump rally with
I saw that
Amish
too.
people for Trump. I'm like, what is happening to me? What am I seeing right now?
Well, and I got this new book, which I think we might cover on the show at some point. But down in the corner,
absolutely.
let's see which corner. This corner.
Yeah.
Rod Dreher wrote the Benedict option, that's precisely what he suggested from Benedict was withdrawal. Withdrawal, create your own culture, your own community, or really have your own set of rules that you govern yourself by, and really almost live in isolation from the world, especially, if they're telling you, like what marriage, if they're redefining marriage would be an example. Well, the Bible defines marriage for us. What the church says marriage is, we can't,
right,
especially now, because they don't agree. It's like, okay, fine, but we're not going to recognize that. And like, can you do that?
That's worked out really well for my congregation. It's been great. The questions and conversations, fantastic.
Over and over.
Yeah. So in many Anabaptist groups, then the church withdrew from secular society and placed itself over and against the dominant culture. In some respects, this model is a resurrection and modification of the ecclesial model.
Right.
We're just going to flatten it out. It's not hierarchical. The church must conform to the whole Bible, and the state must as well.
Did they eat shellfish, by the way?
Right. Did they recline at table for communion?
Okay,
so both Andreas Bodenstein von Karlstadt and Thomas Müntzer, two of my favorite reformers from that era, fall into this category. What happened to those two? I can't remember.
What? You mean the part where they died?
Oh, yeah, that's right. The part where they were executed.
Because they weren't radical enough?
They were not radical enough, or too radical, depending on what side of the bed you're on.
Right.
While Keene identifies biblicism as the fundamental source for this perspective actually grows out of the group's understanding based on the Bible of Christian identity. The interesting thing, too, as an aside, is that St. Augustine's City of God really charts the course for these doctrines.
I thought so, too. I said that in my my conversation about politics this morning in our devotion. Same story.
And no one reads that anymore. I asked seminarians even, I'm like, have you read, how much of Augustine have you read? And, if they do, it's usually Confessions, that kind of stuff, maybe some Pelagian stuff. But like, have you read the City of God?
Right, because that's Augustine actually struggling to be a Christian in a secular society.
Right.
In the Roman society. Right? And if you're looking to the Roman society to be, this kind of place of that reflect biblical doctrines or ethics, no, sorry.
Right.
I mean, it might reflect some understanding of natural law, I guess, but it's always going to be incomplete and corrupt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and he knew that better than anybody, having been a philosopher and taught philosophy.
Exactly. Yeah.
The third approach differs significantly from both the inclusively ecclesial and exclusively biblical models. Often labeled magisterial, the inclusively biblical approach is epitomized by Luther's doctrine of the two kingdoms, or two realms. In Luther's thought, each realm is part of God's plan for ordering creation. The spiritual realm is eternal and everlasting. It is the realm of revelation and faith. Instantiated in the church, it exists to offer the grace of God to all through preaching the word of God and celebrating the sacraments. It is, in a way, a foretaste of the heavenly banquet.
There's that phrase that I'm not particularly fond of, but okay.
Nope. Two motifs run through Luther's thought about the spiritual realm: freedom and equality. Going back to the French Revolution, where do you think they got it from?
Luther puts them in the spiritual realm.
Yes, he does.
Not in the earthly realm. I think that's the.
I said where they got it from. I didn't say where they ended up with them.
Right, exactly.
But that's a great point. It's a very important point, actually, is you take stuff from the spiritual realm,
right,
and then you try to baptize it in the waters of the secular.
Right. Well, for example, equality. Let's do gender equality, because that's a fun topic.
Sure. There's no such thing.
There is no such thing in
actual experience.
In the earthly realm. That's right.
In the earthly realm.
Yeah, male and female are different. I mean, body parts, physiology, on one point, but even
now, to be key, I'm going to be very careful here.
Okay.
I'm not saying that one then is inferior to the other. What I'm saying is there's differences.
Yeah, that's right.
The problem with identity politics is that we assume implicitly that what we're saying means that one is lesser than, which is a Neoplatonic worldview, and that's not what we're talking about.
No, and we were talking about this before we went on air in regards to the vice presidential candidate on one side saying that we should have equal outcome. And like that, it's the same idea in that no, we're not going to have equal outcome because we're all different. Right. We have different.
Listen to Joe Rogan talk about the Secret Service agents at the White House when the guy broke into the White House. Remember that one?
No,
yeah,
I don't.
About the female Secret Service agent.
Oh, this is not going to win any friends, is it?
It's hilarious because he does it really well, though, because he uses Shaquille O'Neal as an example of the difference between him and Shaquille O'Neal as men, and then the difference between him versus a woman. This particular woman who's a member of the Secret Service, who were like, yeah, let's put her at the front door to guard the front door. And then a guy actually broke into the White House.
Right.
And everyone's like, wait, how did he make it? He jumped the fence at the White House, ran across the lawn, ran through the front doors of the White House, which are unlocked, by the way. And so he goes through all of that.
Not
and
anymore.
Then he goes through, like, how did she end up at the front door? Like, how did she, of all Secret Service agents, end up at the front door? And Rogan does a great job of breaking it down, though. And then he talks about himself in relation to the fact that his wife and children are all female. And he's just like, listen, it's not the same. It's not the same. You can scream all you want about equality of outcome, but the fact of the matter is, if we're going to have somebody guarding the president, I don't want a 5'3" 115-pound woman guarding the front door of the White House. And here's why.
Well, I mean, just think about like who's the person they put at the doors of a club, right? The bouncer.
Right.
Are you going to put a skinny soy boy? No.
Right. Unfortunately, it's optics. It has nothing to do with capabilities.
Right. Well, but that's this world.
The fact of the matter is, I would be a better bouncer than those guys.
Yeah. They're just big, burly guys that are meant to be a deterrent.
That's optics. It's like, look, there's more of them. That's the point. There's 6.
There's that too. But in regards to the spiritual realm, of course, we have, that we're all baptized into Christ and we are all equally saved, forgiven. Right. There is no distinction, Paul says, right? Male nor female, Jew, Greek, in Christ, in the spiritual realm. That's right. Although, I mean, one of the things that bugs people, then you get into, these revelation of the throne room of heaven, and you've got an ordering of things in heaven. You're like, well, wait a minute, why do they get a seat closer to the altar? That's not fair. You're like, see, so we have this weird concept.
At the table with Jesus.
What are you worried about?
Doesn't matter. Exactly.
What does it even matter?
The table. It's like we were talking about when I was at seminary, and I would go to I was invited to these dinner parties for a man I worked for, and he would invite all of these extremely, in our ecosystem, extremely influential, important people.
Celebrities, and if there is such a thing.
Celebrities and
theologians.
Circles. Yeah. But especially for a seminarian, you're geeked out. It's like I said, you're an extra on a movie set, and all of a sudden you're at Brad Pitt's dinner party.
Right.
You just can't believe you're there, and you don't belong there. So you just shut up and try and be as small as humanly possible and just absorb everything.
Just enjoy the moment. Yeah.
Just enjoy the moment. But this is the point, is that you can't expect equality of outcome without ignoring the basic rules for creation that God himself has laid out. But when you try and import that then into the spiritual realm and vice versa,
right,
elevating the secular to the spiritual, and somehow men get a better place in heaven than women, or vice versa, or whatever. And technically Jesus says the kingdom of God is for children, but that's a whole other, so we should all just be trying to imitate 10-year-olds, which nowadays seems to be pretty successful project for a lot of people.
Like the idea of envisioning heaven as, the 12 apostles and the 12 patriarchs are the grumpy old guys in the back,
right?
That are just,
and we're all just having a great time.
And all the children are up with Jesus, and those guys are back there just grumbling still about how they don't get to sit at the front.
Oh, how very Lutheran.
So true.
But to pull things down out of the spiritual realm is historically, this is where you see the most damage. Because the roots of communism and socialism are actually biblical.
A distortion.
The distortion of it, which is why you'll have really silly theologians say things like, well, Jesus was a socialist.
Well, just read Acts chapter 2, like 40, 41, 42, somewhere in there. Yeah. And you're like, oh, that sounds like communism. And everybody who reads this, like, that sounds like communism.
Yeah.
And you're like, yeah, because they had all things in common and they took care of those people in need. And you're like, it does sound like communism. And it doesn't go well for them.
And it doesn't go well for them.
It might have been nice at the beginning, but it wasn't under command. I think that's the big distinction as well, is that God enacts reality spiritually through the gospel, right? He changes hearts and minds, and there's love breaks out in the Christian
This is the
congregation, in the
disruption in
family.
Corinth. You have two classes of people at the table.
Right.
And one class is lording it over the other class.
Right. But if you try to instantiate, I love that. Isn't that word so terrific? Yeah. I don't even know what it means. But if you try to create this reality through law, through command, like you all are going to love each other.
Yeah.
Like, oh yeah. See how well that goes.
Right.
Like, tell your sister you're sorry. Like, okay.
If anybody's ever been to a team building seminar or retreat, I can tell you exactly how this goes.
I always leave when they start the icebreaker, because that's the worst part of it.
It really is.
So 1980s.
You and I are not the best people to be at the table. We're like, we're going to do a team building exercise and share. I immediately turn into Wednesday Addams from the Addams Family.
Well, it's either that or you have to take charge.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Either I'm going to control this conversation or I'm just going to leave and go get some coffee.
Yeah. I'm going to turn this into performance art at this point. This is a social experiment now. I'm going to socially injure or something.
Let's see if I can mess with your minds.
Let's see if I can get kicked out of this meeting.
It's so true.
A lot about us. But so there's two motifs that run through Luther's thought: freedom and equality in the spiritual realm.
Right.
Again, Galatians.
We've been teasing that out. Yeah.
Freedom enables one to act on the behalf of others. Revolutionary in this understanding is the revision of status. Did I?
Yep.
Oh, sorry. Again, I told you, I'm not having a good day. Freedom enables one to act on the behalf of others. We are perfectly free from human obligations that we might serve others. If only there were a text that we could recommend.
I don't know.
Could read about this.
Freedom of the Christian? That's the one that comes to mind.
Yeah. That's a good one. I like that one.
The title's kind of on the nose, probably, but
it is. Perfectly, Lord. Yeah. I like it. So we are perfectly free from human obligations to serve others, which, as you noted, only goes sideways when you're commanded. You must love others. Well, what if I don't? You have to, but I don't.
If you take Paul seriously, as soon as you tell somebody they have to, they won't.
Right. This is why Jesus commands us to forgive each other.
To show us that we can't?
Yeah. Because he knows better.
Okay.
Just like he commands us to love each other. Because he knows better. Revolutionary in this understanding is the revision of status. The spiritual realm is not governed hierarchically. In this realm, all Christians are equal. In the spiritual realm.
And by the way, when we say spiritual,
I actually learned this at seminary because I went to an ELCA seminary. We actually learned this at seminary. This is the argument that was used to push gay ordination and gay marriage. Well, we're all the same in Christ, and therefore in Christ, through faith, we're all equal. And so only those who have no faith create inequality.
You mean you didn't learn this in the way that Luther says it, but rather, okay. Backwards, upside down.
I learned it backwards.
I wanted to also note, and I don't know if he does it here because I haven't read this in a long time, but the when he says, that we're free and equal in the spiritual realm, he's not talking about the church on earth, our experience of the church.
No.
Right.
Which is another confusion of the two kingdoms, is when you come into church and go, well, now I've entered into kind of like in Harry Potter, when you have to go and get on the train to go to Hogwarts.
Right.
You have to go to the platform. It's like
15 and a half or whatever it is. 9.5. 9.5.
9.5. The church is platform 9.5. This is the in-between spot on our way to meet Gandalf.
Oh, I thought it's the train station at the end with all the white light.
What is that? That's my wife's favorite book/cartoon, the toll booth at the end of the world, or no, that's Neil Gaiman.
Phantom Toll Booth.
The Phantom Toll Booth, that's her favorite. Yeah, Phantom Toll Booth. The inn at the end of the world is Gaiman, I think, or the end of the universe. Either way, someone.
Oh, that's restaurant at the end of the universe.
No, that's Douglas Adams. This is the problem with literacy and age. You're right. It's the restaurant at the end of the universe.
Oh, I thought you were talking about the world's end.
Douglas Adams, right?
Yeah.
And then Neil Gaiman wrote one like the inn at the end of the world, or at the end of the universe, which is about a guy who chooses never to die, which is in the Sandman series.
Oh, that's why I don't know what you're talking about. There's
going
to be
a Sandman series.
I haven't, no, because it's graphic novel. I have a hard time reading those.
How dare you?
I know. The Netflix series.
I think they did a BBC radio series.
That was Neverwhere. Yeah,
I love that.
different
Love it.
show as well. That was also
Great.
interesting. Book's good
They
though.
also did a BBC show of Neverwhere.
That's what I'm thinking of, is the show.
Yeah.
Okay.
Not the biggest budget. So the spiritual realm is not governed hierarchically. All Christians are equal. So if you've ever wondered why there were movements in the 16, 17, 1800s that moved away from a hierarchical organization of the church into a more egalitarian congregational organization, one was culture.
Mm-hmm.
Two was this.
They took the
misreading of the
gospel
Bible.
and applied it to secular life.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I can tell you exactly what happens when there's no chief. There's a lot of chiefs.
Too many cooks in the kitchen?
Way too many cooks. So Luther writes, all Christians are truly in the spiritual estate, and there is no difference among them except that of function. So again, in relation to you who are listening, we are the same. We're equal in Christ. However, in our vocations and in our functions, we are different.
As Paul says in 1 Corinthians, yes.
Exactly. That we are all one body, with every member having his or her own function by which he or she serves the others. This is because we have one baptism, one gospel, and one faith, and are all Christians just the same as each other. For baptism, gospel, and faith alone make us spiritual and a Christian people. It follows from the argument that there is no true basic difference between laymen and priests, princes and bishops, between religion and secular, except for the sake of office and work, but not for the sake of status.
Right. So this is directly connected then to the doctrine that we're saved by faith through grace, alone, and not by works, right? As Paul says.
Right.
Because if it were by works, then of course we're going to qualitatively judge vocational, even vocational output. So you say, well, let's compare one pastor to another, right? Well, that guy's certainly more important. So let's make him a bishop or an archbishop or a cardinal or something, right?
That'll fix him.
Let's create this hierarchy. Yeah. And no, it actually does the opposite, doesn't it?
It kind of does. Yeah.
Right. Well, and we're not saying that you can't judge between people, and that you shouldn't, but all that you can't like distinguish between, well, that guy was a really great pastor for me. Sure. Fair enough.
Vocationally. Absolutely.
Sure. Yeah. But before God, right?
Right.
No, that's not the question.
Right.
Who is he? Who is he before God or she?
Right. Right. It's like yesterday,
Baptized.
I apologized to the council, not for my preaching or my conducting of the liturgy yesterday. I apologized for not showing up prepared to do my job properly and not showing the proper reverence and respect for my job, and for not respecting the time of my congregation because they're there. And long story short, I got stretched out like butter on too much bread. I forgot to eat yesterday morning, and I almost fainted like 6 times during the divine service and had to sit down several times during the conducting of my duties. And everyone's like, yeah, hey, it happens. Don't worry about it. I'm like, no, you don't understand. Vocationally, I have a problem with what happened yesterday. I'm not saying that the Holy Spirit didn't work yesterday. The sacrament was celebrated. We're good. I'm saying vocationally, I'm judging myself and saying that ain't going to happen again.
Right.
That was my fault.
Right.
But if we flip that and we don't recognize, okay, well, pastor almost fainted during church and he had to sit down during the reading of the Old Testament, or, during the Lord's Supper, he wasn't the same as he always is, blah, blah. If we judge that way, then we get back to the Donatist controversy and other such controversies. That is, well, it's the performance of your duties, your vocation, that determine whether or not it's spiritual or not. Versus, no, that's not how it works. And if it does, I quit.
Yeah.
I'm doomed.
Yeah.
No bueno. So since in baptism there's no longer Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, in the spiritual realm there are no distinctions of class or authority. As Jesus explained to his disciples in Matthew 20, in the spiritual kingdom, service to others, not status, is definitive.
So
by
like
the way, go ahead.
When somebody says to you, like, well, pastor, I know you're a man of God or a holy man or something, and like, I don't think you actually know me. And yes, I do study the Bible probably more than you do, but because it's my job. I mean, I wouldn't do it if it weren't.
Do this.
Right.
I'm not saying it would be like 80-20. I'm just saying it'd be less.
Well, pastor, why do you schedule Bible studies? It's like, if I don't schedule them, I'm not going to do them. I mean, if it's
Actually, I had to correct myself. I read the Bible front to back 7 times in a row and then went to seminary, and almost immediately the amount of time I spent reading the Bible dropped off.
Yeah. Why did I bring that up? Oh, we're just talking
It
about
doesn't
class or
matter.
authority. It's like,
Right.
no, you have, I mean, this is the beauty of the Reformation, right?
Mhm.
Is that you have full and complete access to the Word of God in a way that,
Yeah.
in the way that hadn't been done, mostly because of the printing press,
Ever. Yeah.
right? But also you had kind of, I would say, an intentional repression in the medieval church.
Mhm.
Like, we're not going to teach the people
Right.
Latin. We're not going to teach them what the Bible says
Oh, that
because
would be bad for us. Yeah.
right, that gives us a position of authority where we can say what
Mhm.
the Bible says and they can't fact check
Right.
us.
Right.
Who fact
Well,
checks the fact
and
checker?
here's the backside of my anecdote / this point, which is that the whole reason that I was in the condition I was when I got to church yesterday morning is because I had devoted the last 48 hours up to that entirely to serving other people.
Mm,
Entirely. My
hmm.
entire day was taken up with helping other people, serving other people, so that I didn't take care of myself.
Yeah.
And then it cost me in my vocation and my service to others. And as a missionary, I saw the opposite side of this, which is we get so caught up in the spiritual realm
Mm,
that we
okay.
neglect the vocational responsibilities we have. So we neglect our kids, our wife. If you're pastors, this is always a temptation to
Right.
neglect your family. Or you spend so much time with one vocation and then the other vocations in your life, they suffer because you, like you said, you create this hierarchy of like spiritual hierarchy of value. And therefore being a pastor is the highest spiritual value. And then it works its way down from there, which essentially just means everybody gets whatever's left of you
Right.
after the church has taken what it needs from you. It's a pound of flesh versus no, in relation to Christ, as Luther notes, there is no class or authority. There is no hierarchy of vocations. You're either in Christ through faith or you're not.
Right. Right. And I
And that
think,
a plumber, for example, is no less or of no greater or lesser importance to Christ than a pastor or a king.
you can see, Jesus himself struggle, being true man. He
Mhm.
struggles with that,
Mhm.
love and vocation that he often has to retreat to an isolated place or into the
Right.
boat, just for the sake of his flesh, right? I mean that
Right.
he's got to sleep, he's got to take care of
Mhm.
himself, he's got to have something to eat. Although he's
Right.
40 days without food in the wilderness, that's a pretty long fast.
It's a little much.
It's a little much. Well, this is the thing
Stop
with
showing
Jesus,
off.
right? Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. He does set a kind of an impossibly high standard for us to live up to.
That's right. Be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect.
Complete, whatever, finished. The
Yeah.
So you see this though in his own ministry is that he often runs himself ragged as well.
Mhm.
Um, and but he can do that.
Mhm.
One, he's not married, by the way.
Right. That helps a
Children to care
lot.
for. I mean, he gives himself completely to that work in a way that
Mhm.
our vocations aren't nearly as well. They're just more complicated. We have
Right.
multiple
And so we
vocations.
read that text and then we immediately create a vocation out of it.
Mm, right. Well, that's the monastic life, right?
Right.
Because
That's
they
what I'm
try
saying
to.
though, is like it's him doing something that he specifically needs to do. And then
Mhm.
we're like, what we should definitely do is create an entire vocation around this
Where
text
we try to replicate it. Yeah.
on earth.
Uh-huh. No.
Yeah. Because now we're closer to Jesus.
Right. Well, and I mean, there's the one key distinction is that you could try to replicate it, but you can't do it without sin. So it's
Well,
not going to go well.
and by the late Middle Ages, everything not monastic was considered secular.
Oh,
Even
that's
the
true.
Pope
Yeah.
was secular. So if you weren't a monk or a nun, everything else was secular. That's how far that went. There
Secular.
was also an economic reason for that, but we don't have to
Right.
get
But
into
I'm,
that.
I'm trying to think of the etymology of the word. Right. It
Which
comes
one?
secular, related to an
Mm,
age or a period,
yeah,
right? From the Latin, secularis.
secularis.
So generation or age. So it's the timey people versus the
Hmm.
eternal people. Okay.
Yeah,
All
yeah.
right.
And who wants to be a part of the timey-wimey people?
Hmm.
I want to be part of the eternal people. I want to live forever.
The cool crowd. Yeah.
The cool crowd. Become a monk. Shave your head. Like the law to the gospel, the secular realm is the spiritual realm's dialectical partner. We use the word dichotomy. They used to use the word dialectic.
I like
Basically, there's
dichotomy.
two parts to this. There's two sides to this.
Yeah, that's because we have Hegel. We-
Yes, the
We're trying to
Hegelian
avoid Hegel.
dialectic.
Yeah.
We do. Naughty, naughty, no bueno. It is the realm of reason and unbelief. Both the secular and spiritual exist for God's regulation of creation. Didn't we read this in Saze? Isn't this almost like exactly lifted from Saze when we read him?
I don't remember. Maybe.
Because this sounds, yeah. But
Well, but
like law and gospel,
he's reflecting on Luther and Zosimus
yeah.
too.
So
Yeah.
Saze, yeah. Both the secular and spiritual exist for God's regulation of creation, but like law and gospel, they play different roles. Whereas the spiritual realm is eternal and proleptic, and I did an entire paper at seminary on proleptic eschatology, if you'd ever like to be bored to tears someday.
It makes me
The
think of
secular
a
is
different
finite and
thing.
fleeting.
Prolapse, which is a totally
No,
different
prolapse
word.
is a whole other, no. That's a different kind of theology.
What does proleptic mean? Define it for our audience.
Proleptic, it's, oh God, now you put me on the spot. But basically you're moving toward the end.
Anticipation and answering of possible objections in rhetorical speech. A representation of a thing as existing before it actually does or did so.
So the way that we put it is this way. The Holy Spirit comes from the future in the affirmative to tell you what's going to happen.
And in a way, it's already happened, even though it hasn't.
It's already happened, right. So proleptic eschatology means we're not only moving toward the last day, we're in the last end times.
My professor called it inaugurated eschatology, but it's the same idea.
Proleptic was coined by, I think it was Pannenberg.
That would be why we didn't use the word. Okay.
Yeah, Wolfhart Pannenberg and Jürgen Moltmann were the two big kind of pushers of proleptic eschatology on one side of the fence.
Well, it's like our epistle reading for All Saints Day, right? Where he talks about what we are now has not yet appeared.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So anyways, proleptic, the secular is finite and fleeting. So in the spiritual realm, what happens? The Holy Spirit comes from the future and goes, here's your fate.
Back to the
future.
In the
secular, they can't tell you what's going to happen at the end of today.
Because they don't know.
Because they don't know, which is why we like to drag the spiritual into the secular, because we want to control the future.
Well, right. And even if you have a plan, I mean, anybody who has a sound kind of reflection on reality knows that plans change. And outcomes, right. You know, there's too much chaos to predict outcome.
Chaos is the absence of God.
It's like, hey, you know what? We could encourage these people to riot and protest, and we can use that for our aim. And then what happens? Oh, they riot and protest, and they do that against us too. Like, that's not what we wanted. Like, sorry, can't control a riot.
Right.
Yeah.
I should have said the absence of God for us. That's what chaos is. It's the absence of God for us.
Right. Well, and there's no, like we said, there's no gospel in in the secular realm. So there is the for you is all law.
Yeah.
It's all judgment.
Here, the sword then, instead of the service, is definitive. Correct. Sword instead of service. This is when we read Augustine on just war.
Right.
Is that, or Luther on whether a soldier can be a Christian, who's really updating that doctrine from Augustine, saying, I agree, but I also disagree, and I'm going to tweak this, which is that there's a time for the sword. There's a time for service. Sometimes the sword is the service for loving your neighbor, but then there's a time for the gospel.
Yeah. So you can't command, think of the secular, you can't command people to show love for one another.
Especially with the sword.
Right. I mean, you think of like our attempts at this, I don't know, like the welfare state, for example.
Sure.
But it's not love. It's actually
forced charity. Yeah.
Yeah. It's forced charity. Right. And since so many of the charitable things that God does command and that are fruits of faith have been co-opted by the state, and like you said, I think it's helpful, the diagnosis that we've made here, that it's a co-opting of a religious idea, but they take something that's meant to be a gift and they turn it into or service and turn it into a sword or into law.
Well, you know what forced love is called. We have a legal definition of forced love. It's called rape.
Yeah.
I'm going to force you. I'm going to force you to return my love, even though you don't want to.
We could call it unjust taxation.
You can call it unjust taxation. You can call it being raped. It's just what it is.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be physical. But the point is then that, yes, to be ravaged, for example, which is where we get the word rape from, it is to be forced to do something that is to occur spontaneously and in freedom, which is why we don't, and taken to its extreme, by the way, the Western understanding of romantic love comes out of this. Well, we can't force people to love each other. Therefore, no more arranged marriages. No more, hey, you'll love each other eventually. People should be free to fall in love, become romantically in love with each other. This is where dating comes from, by the way, so that they can figure out whether or not they are compatible and they can love each other or not. Notice the language of choice and freedom within romantic love. I get it.
Yeah.
Not every arranged marriage is, you're not going to show up and be like, oh, yay, I hit the lottery. Fantastic. This is going to be great. But on the flip side, you give a human being freedom of choice,
they're going to
it
abuse
doesn't
it.
really work out too well for us most times.
Right.
So therefore, God institutes the sword in order to protect us from our neighbor who says, I'm going to serve myself rather than you. I'm going to force charity. I'm going to force love. I'm going to force you to take care of my wants that I'm going to define as needs.
Right. But the problem is with that as well, especially if they co-opt like religious ideology and turn it into force, is that then we're actually prohibited from loving one another in ways, right? Legally prohibited.
100%.
You know, like I was in Illinois for a while, and there was no more Catholic adoption agencies because the state said you can't restrict where you place these children, you know, to what a Catholic definition of a loving household would be, which is a male and female, right? Now you can't do that anymore. And so you can't be in the adoption business. And like, but we want to help place these children in homes, but you're telling us we can't do it. Well, because your definition is wrong. Right.
Well, and then theologically, it creates an extremely difficult obstacle to overcome, which is you're not welcome at our table because you voted the wrong way.
Yeah,
you didn't vote
that's
for
true.
the Christian candidate. You didn't vote for the candidate who is the servant of the kingdom, and therefore you're not welcome in this community anymore.
There was a Christian candidate?
Always.
I've missed it.
There's always a Christian candidate, depending on which party you're a part of.
Well, I mean, I think there's candidates that call themselves Christians, but
I know I'm being extremely sarcastic.
Well, I know, and I'm helping our reader understand that you're being sarcastic. Yes,
I was joking.
Listener, sorry, not readers.
Whichever.
Whatever.
Just as the law serves God by enlightening persons to their sinful condition and thus prepares them for the proclamation of the gospel, the secular realm limits the outbreak of sin and malfeasance and thus creates a climate where the gospel can be preached. That may be the most important sense in this.
That's kind of what I was trying to say. Look at that.
There we go.
He says it better than I did.
The law exists to protect the proclamation of the gospel.
The state exists.
The state exists to protect the proclamation of the gospel. Therefore, going back to an earlier point, the reason that I reject the state's definition of marriage is because it is not biblical by any stretch of the imagination, and they changed the verbiage. It's not a marriage, it's a civil union. Therefore, I don't have to honor the state's definition of marriage because they got rid of marriage and they substituted in civil unions.
That was an accommodation for us, but yeah.
Yeah, hey, I'll take it at this point.
I know.
Because it creates theological and secular confusion.
Well,
for most people.
This is why I like the term holy matrimony. I know it sounds all churchy and stuff, but
because it is.
But it makes that distinction. It helps make that distinction.
It does, yeah.
Yeah. You've been set apart by God for one another. You know, that's what makes it holy. And
so at Magdeburg, which this book is about, the question becomes, when do you resist secular authority? And the answer is when they prohibit the proclamation of the gospel by their choices, by their legislation.
And if you're in the U.S. context, that would be First Amendment?
Yes, it would be.
It would be, yeah.
That's why we read John MacArthur.
By the way, in the Democratic Party platform, it actually does say that you're not free to practice your religion outside of the church building, basically.
Correct.
That's
or in my state, inside the church building either.
Well, there's that too. We've had this conversation. I feel like we've had this conversation.
I think we've had this conversation before.
For about 9 months.
This is a great time to have it again.
Yeah.
Which is, I was asked as an example then, and we talked about this because you and I were both in a mood for the previous 2 episodes.
A little.
Come out. We were a little bit in a mood, for those of you who haven't heard them yet. Stop asking for permission to celebrate the sacrament and the proclamation of the gospel from secular authorities. We don't do that.
Another way to say it would be stop asking permission to be a Christian.
Yes, exactly. We don't need permission to be Christians. We were given freedom to be Christians.
Right.
And they can, when secular authority or secular people in general say, no, you're putting us all at risk. Okay. And
this is one of those times where I wish I had a kilt and blue face paint, you know?
Yeah, I know. I'm literally stopping God from destroying you right now and throwing you into hell. Really? You want to talk about how I'm not protecting you? I'm literally praying that God will not destroy you today so that you can be converted. I got bigger issues I'm dealing with than wearing a mask.
Yeah.
P.S. You've never come to my church before. And you're not a Christian, so chill the rhetoric. The point is, no, we don't ask for permission to be Christians. And we do that only so far as we hold the distinction between the secular and the spiritual. And that's why I recommend this book to everybody, Tyranny and Resistance, because that's the whole topic of this book is about when is a government tyrannical?
Right.
When is it okay as Christians to resist the government? What does that then look like? For example, do you call in the military for like at Magdeburg? Do you expect the soldiery of Magdeburg to stand on the walls and defend you against the Pope's army?
Right.
Or or do you just go to church on Sunday and take your shots?
Well,
What does that even mean?
That's a great point that, a lot of our listeners are going to be coming from a Lutheran perspective. Not all of them, maybe not even most of them. I don't know.
Shout out to all our non-Lutheran brothers and sisters, by the way.
But for those of us who are Lutherans, like I said, we don't know our history in particular, our particular Lutheran history. We might know a little bit of the Reformation time stuff, but we don't know about the second, third generations, and the conflicts. We don't know about the founding of our church body in particular, and that it was born out of religious conflict in part. And if we don't know that history, if we don't know our own, even the conflicts in our own congregation, I mean, you've talked about yours. I've had mine. My congregation's had their fair share in the last 165 years. If we don't know those things, we lose our guard actually against them, because I mean, those our parents, our forefathers, however you want to put it, they went through that for our benefit,
right?
Not only to preserve the church for us, but they want us to know. They don't want us to forget our history, because you're doomed to repeat it then.
Yeah. Well, that's how Caesar essentially became Caesar. Julius became Caesar. Julius went into Rome and reminded everybody, remember like a couple centuries ago where we got our butts handed to us by these folks over here in Gaul and the Germanic tribes?
Yeah.
Well, if you make me Caesar, I'm going to go avenge the deaths of all of our great-grandparents.
Yeah.
And the people that he was speaking to, this is literally like over 200, 300, 400 years previous this has happened. None of these people he's talking to were there. They don't have knowledge of it. But he's bringing it back to their attention for political purposes, because he knows I need something. This is my leverage.
I've thought about this with politicians, but I think it probably applies to pastors as well. It applies to both realms. Is that the best politicians are good storytellers? You think of like the fireside chats, or even Reagan did this, Kennedy did that. I mean, they knew how to not spin the narrative, but to make the history relevant to the contemporary setting.
I think in the
tell the story.
Maybe not the next election cycle, but maybe in 2 or 3 from now, what you're going to see is the first president to do a podcast, like a regular podcast.
Oh, I think it's going to be in the next cycle.
I do. I
don't think we're going to wait that long.
Well, I mean, to do it well. Okay, let me be more.
Okay, there you go.
To do it well,
popularly.
There's the boomers. I don't think are capable of doing it well.
Just because they don't even understand cell phones. Yeah, exactly.
Sure.
Is this thing on?
Gen Xers, exactly. And they stick their nose in there. Can you see me? But I think our generation, Gen Xers, who are the adapters, we're the ones who are going to figure it out. And then
I'd say it's the millennials. I think it's the millennials.
Yeah, I think we'll do it.
But they're already in office. We already have millennials in office, so it's going to happen.
How's that working out?
Well, I mean, they're on both sides of the aisle.
Shout out to the conservative millennials, by the way. You guys are kicking butt. You guys are awesome.
Yeah. How about that the Texas campaign ad, right? Where
I'm just saying, like, anybody who's down on millennials and Gen Xers are certainly guilty of this, because we envy you for your ability to turn hobbies into jobs. And some of us adapted.
Right.
But no, the millennials that I've interfaced with now, especially on social media, who are conservatives. And by that, I mean, literally, like, they're anywhere from, like, I was in the middle of the road leaning left to all of a sudden I found myself one day being conservative, or I was compelled to the right through like Thomas Sowell and others.
Right. Yeah.
Super impressive human beings, I think.
Yeah. Like Candace Owens,
intellectually and just socially, just impressive people.
Sean Parnell, Candace Owens. Who else are you thinking of?
Just
maybe Crenshaw a little. I think Crenshaw's there.
Crенshaw's on the edge of that. He's a little bit rhino for me, though.
Who's the Kim Kasich? The gal from
Kim Kasich. She's awesome.
Yeah, I mean,
Kasich.
she was. I mean, she was compelled to run because of a viral
that's what
video.
I mean, though, is like, there's another woman down from, I think, Savannah, Atlanta area. Stanton King.
Okay.
But anyways, every time one pops up and I take a moment to listen to them or read what they're saying, I'm like, oh, you get it.
That's the point. They're compelling storytellers.
They are. They're telling a story. Like that classic, the classic commercial put her on the map.
Where she walks the street. Yeah. And she shows the reality. Yeah.
Like, nailed it. So anyways, I mean, that's to me, like, I didn't start off here. I feel like I was pushed here against my will in a certain sense politically.
Right. And you've communicated that. That's part of your story.
Yeah, it is. And
it does resonate with people then.
Well, I think the point is, for me anyways, is I'm always coming back to or holding this position that he's describing here, which is you have to hold these two kingdoms in tension. Because when you let them slip, I, more than anybody else I know, like there's days where I'm just like, you know what? Let's just go to the Capitol. Let's just tear that dude out of his office. Let's just do this. This is never going to change. We got to just rip this guy out of his seat.
I get it.
Do it.
Oh, I totally get it.
You know, 100%. I'm like, we have got to stop talking. We have got to stop peacefully protesting. Let's just rip this guy out. Let me be the Hidalgo of Minnesota. Let me
take it to the next level. Yeah.
Let's take it to the next level, dude. Let's just cash that check. But then there's other days where it's like, no, dude, God will take care of this. Like, just shut up and pray. Just
well, and that's why I brought up revolt. Is that revolt is not conservative. It's not respective of history. I think that's the big issue for me, regardless of whether they know the history of revolt. Actually, I think the ones who are organizing them, they do. Because they bring in all the, not only ideology, but the iconography, right? Like the hand 100%. Thing and all that.
Yes.
They bring in all these icons and signs that have been used, or the flags or whatever. So I think they do know the history of revolutions. They even pick some pretty obscure ones, you know, for their nomenclature and whatnot. But those who are caught up in them don't understand that this is not something new and it's been tried before. You know?
Well, let's float this out and see as a thought experiment at the end of this. It's relatively easy for me to go from 0 to 11 in relation to the law.
Yeah, no doubt.
But when it comes to the proclamation of the gospel, especially as a pastor in my vocation, even the people that I want to punch into next week, all of a sudden now I'm literally saying, I don't like, I physically want to violently put my hands on you and bend you into different shapes. But Jesus died for you.
That's not how it works. Yeah.
And then all of a sudden I still have these emotions, but now I'm starting to move toward sympathy, essentially, which is, I don't want this to be the last thing that you have to go away from me with, or the last thing that you hear on this earth.
Right.
I want you to hear the gospel of Jesus Christ, because this is all that matters.
Well, and it alone is the power of God unto salvation.
Right, exactly. And so when you drag the spiritual into the secular out in the street, or you drag the secular into the spiritual in the pulpit, I would argue inevitably it's not the law that's going to suffer, even though it will as a consequence of the gospel not being there, because now you're not preaching the law lawfully because there's no evangelical word to follow it up with. By compromising the gospel of Jesus Christ and not preaching the for you to that person that you politically even despise,
right,
you're cutting them off from salvation. You have the words of eternal life. Where else are we going to go? Versus, okay, especially if it's on Christian terms, like you're calling another brother a baptized Christian not a Christian, based on how they're voting or how they protest or whatever. Versus, okay, is this something that is so insurmountable that we can't reconcile and then receive the sacrament together? Or are we just going to pretend it doesn't exist and we're going to go to the table unworthily and receive the sacrament together? Or are we going to say, no, it's a deal breaker?
Yeah.
You go to your church and say you're a real Christian. I'll go to my church and say I'm a real Christian. One of us is not preaching the gospel. I'm just saying. Maybe both of us aren't preaching the gospel. But this is the inclusive, exclusive language that he's talking about too.
Right. And I would say this, and that there are some political ideologies that are atheistic or even antichrist.
Yeah.
And those, I mean, those do set you apart from Jesus, you know, where maybe sometimes just by priority, you know, that you care more about your politics than you do about your faith, you know, but other times it's like we were talking about, like the command to love one another. That's not given to the state. I'm sorry. You can try to.
Adam wants it.
I know.
That's the temptation.
But I do think the thing that really makes people uncomfortable, and like you said, you and I have maybe changed a bit in the way that we will bring politics to bear, but we use it. It's to be preached. It's preached
diagnostic.
Right. It reveals sin.
Yeah.
You know, we see how our politics expose our sinful, you know, idolatry or our weakness or our rejection of humanity, even of the way that God made us. Yeah. And so we can use it that way. But that doesn't really, I mean, your political affiliation as far as a party, you're going to be equally damned under both, actually.
Right.
Because there's no gospel in it. Yeah.
Because there's no gospel. Exactly.
Right.
There's no salvation in politics.
Oops.
But the earthly temptation is always to sell out. In our society, it's every 4 years, essentially, we sell out hard, one way or the other.
Not midterms. Yeah. Definitely presidential.
But and that's why you'll notice this time around, it's much more apocalyptic.
I think so. Yeah. I mean, we've had it before, but I think this time it's more apocalyptic because there's actually a known threat.
Yeah.
You can call it globalism, you can call it China, you can call it whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
But we actually see a threat, and at least you and I do, in a way that, you know, I think, like, what was the threat under, like, when Obama said hope and change in 2008, wasn't it? 2008, 2012? Yeah.
The global war on terror.
I guess it was terrorists still, maybe? I don't.
But that was so vague and general and malleable.
Yeah, exactly. And you look at the wars that they were involved in, wars, quote unquote, really conflicts.
In a way, China has become the new Soviet Union for us.
Yeah, I think so.
Because they're this monolithic entity, and you can read Animal Farm again and substitute in China for Russia. And, you know, the players may have changed, but it seems like, here we are again.
The ideology hasn't. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well, because communism is a movement. Well,
and I would say that China is much more nuanced, actually, in their approach. The way they've been able to synergize some Western ideas into it.
Well, they certainly learned a lot from Russia and their failure.
Exactly. So they've gotten better at it. Yeah. Right.
They also have an older culture, though. Yeah.
But that's a real present danger, I think, in a way that at least some Americans seem to recognize. You know.
Some. Yeah.
Yeah. And that nationalism isn't necessarily a bad idea.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Especially nowadays.
Because forced conformity, like conforming everyone to a common standard of law, or common currency, or common cultural norms, you know, we know how that goes. You can't force people to do these things, and without destroying their freedom, destroying their and their integrity as individuals or as cultures, right? So we actually, I think, as Christians, we want to be able to allow people to be unique and different, embrace.
That's why we like the Constitution. Bill of Rights are kind of awesome that way. They're very specific, and yet they form a boundary within which there's freedom.
Like, I wouldn't say that we should, like, shut down democratic socialists, for example, from being able to speak or something, you know. I think, you know, they should be able to speak at the table, but they, you know, to have a revolution and, you know, kill everybody that doesn't agree with them, and then we can't give them freedom to do that. Sorry.
Right. Yeah. Any more than we could give the opposite extreme the same rights and freedoms.
Oh yeah, some kind of, like, what, you know, ethnic cleansing or something.
Yeah.
Right.
So to wrap this section up, then, with this, so let's just walk it back. So the law serves God by enlightening persons to their sinful condition and prepares them for the proclamation of the gospel. The secular realm limits the outbreak of sin and malfeasance, and thus creates a climate where the gospel can be preached. With this understanding, St. Paul urged, quote, that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgivings be made for everyone, for kings and all who are in high positions, so that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life in all godliness and dignity. 1 Timothy 2, verses 1 and 2.
That's kind of idealistic, Paul.
Paul, you dreamer. The secular realm orders the communal life in the home, in the city, in the state. It ensures that the unjust will not run rampant over the weak and the downtrodden, which is my point about when we read Augustine on just war again, and where we disagreed with him at, that only a police officer or a soldier can bear the sword, for example. Or we're like, no, you come in my house, I'm going to put you down.
Right. But we do this when we discipline our children. You know,
we do.
When the big brother, you know, picks on the little kid or something. Yeah. Like, that's unjust. And we're not going to allow that. Yeah.
Right. In fact, we had this conversation yesterday in relation to Psalm 119 and the commandments, that where earthly authority lines up with God's law, natural law, we say, good. That's good. For example, don't murder.
Right.
Like, not murdering your neighbor is a good thing. That's a just thing, not murdering your neighbor.
Although unjustly executed in our setting.
But when it is unjustly executed, such as full-term abortion,
right,
we say that is not just, that is murder. Now we have a problem because we are saying, as people of faith, the 10 Commandments as a, what do you want to say, expression of natural law, of God's law that's written on our hearts, has been violated.
At least the second table of them, yeah.
The second table in relation to our neighbor has been violated. Now, what we discover, and this is, I think, why you see these different movements struggle with the Bible and this relationship to then secular authority is, biblically speaking, if I commit murder against my neighbor, it's usually because I'm worshiping a false god. The first table, this is why I explained it to my Bible study group. Moral evil is a consequence of spiritual turning away from God. So it's not like it's, hey, you're morally evil, therefore you're not a Christian. Usually it's a consequence. Like moral evil is usually a consequence of spiritual evil.
Right.
You can be a morally good person and not be a Christian. You can be a morally evil person and not be a Christian too. Usually, though, it's the moral evil, the second table of the commandment stuff, is violated as a consequence of, I have a different God.
Yeah.
I don't use God's name correctly. I don't gladly hear and learn God's word. And typically the immoral stuff comes as a consequence. Like I said, you turn away from Jesus and the cross and you start looking at your neighbors, that's when, stuff starts to go sideways. But yet, then we as a church, you and I would stand up and say, okay, listen, this is murder. This is unjust murder. It's unreasonable. It's unjustified. It's murder. I don't care if it's legal. It's immoral. And it's immoral, not based on my personal taste buds, my yes or no of my personal taste, but based on God's law. And ultimately then my obedience to the law, natural law in this case, starts with, well, what has God said? And then flows from that. So I can say, yeah, it's legal, but I think it's morally evil. And it's morally evil based on natural law. And I have a couple thousand years of Western philosophy that agrees with me.
Yeah, that's true too.
So even the philosophers grasp this, right?
Right.
So then as Christians, and this is kind of what I'm driving at too, is that, as pastors, as Christians, when we recognize that something is not godly in relation to the law and natural law, what do we as Christians do? Well, what do Jews do? What do Muslims do in relation to natural law? Specifically Jewish folks, because they have 10 Commandments. What do they do? Well, we see this in New York City now with the pogroms and the way that they're trying to isolate the Orthodox Jews according to voting precincts. Actually.
Isn't that something? Yeah.
I'm like, oh, wow. It's so weird that you can just overlay these two things.
That's coincidence.
Yeah, weird. What did the Jews say? Yeah, we're going to go celebrate, actually. That's our thing. It's our holy day. And you don't get to tell us what to do because God.
Generally, they're, you wouldn't even know they're there.
No, exactly.
Until you push.
Super low key. Yeah.
Yeah, until you
we're
push.
Gonna worship. We're gonna go out and celebrate Sukkot. Okay, great. We're not affecting anybody. We're in our neighborhood. You can't do that. I'm sorry. Who said that?
Right. When the cops come up to your, and try to get into your home and try to break up your religious observance, things have gotten a little off the rails here.
A little off the rails.
Yeah.
For Christians, people ask me, are we going to have Thanksgiving service this year? Thanksgiving isn't a quote unquote Christian holiday, but we still do it because it's a day, it's an opportunity to get together and receive the gifts of salvation and then go home and give thanks
for all the gifts.
The secular. Yeah, exactly. And for me, it's just another excuse to have the Lord's Supper and to recenter ourselves in, this is where the stuff comes from. We read the Hallel Psalms, all that stuff.
Yeah.
But the point is then, if the governor says to us, well, you can't celebrate Thanksgiving, you can't have church service on Thanksgiving. Okay.
Not your business.
I'll see you at 10 o'clock on Thursday morning.
Yeah, exactly.
Whether it's called Thanksgiving service or Christmas Eve service, or whether this is the day Jesus was actually born or not, doesn't matter. That's not the point.
I know people are screaming, they're saying, but there's a pandemic. But we've already had that conversation enough, probably.
It's a hoax. Yeah. Look at the numbers.
Well, it's a disease, but yes,
COVID's real. I'm not saying that's not real. I'm saying that everything around it's been a hoax for the most
part.
Exaggerated, perverted, twisted, used as a system of oppression. Keep going. The point is, we don't ask for permission. And whether it's quote unquote Thanksgiving service, that's not the point. It's what are you doing in the service? What is the service? It's the gospel and the gifts of salvation.
That's the point. Yeah.
That's the point. And we don't need to come up with a quote unquote special reason to gather around the Lord's table. We just use that because that's a secular, and I use that as an example because it's a secular holiday. Thanksgiving is a secular American holiday.
Well,
and yet we as Christians co-opted it here locally for an excuse to celebrate the sacrament and go, hey, just so you know, when you go to your table to eat, all the people around your table with all the food on it, yeah, that's all from God.
Right. Well, it was a couple of months ago, I think, here on the podcast, though, we talked about, the thing that offended me most about at least my particular governor's orders was that he specified, how to worship. I'm like,
yes,
it's one thing to say
can't
it's a
sing, can't
pandemic
chant.
and we're
Yeah.
discouraging you from gathering together in large groups, XYZ size or whatever,
Right.
or, indoors or all that sort of stuff. But then to say, well, here's when you can wear a mask when you're officiating. Here's where you can't. Here's whether you can sing or not. Here's what Like, I think you're overstepping the bounds here. I understand your reasons for it. You're trying to provide guidance, but you're doing it through mandate, and it's not going to work. Not going to work.
Right.
No, we're going to, exercise caution appropriately,
Yeah.
But, state church relations, isn't it
And
fun?
this is what, when we talked about, and I talked about the disintegration of the wall between those two, or at least the tension between those two. That's where you see them mixed together.
Yeah. I linked in the show notes, I linked to the original article that reminded me about this book from President Harrison back in 2016. So it's linked down there, but he does have a long quote from James Madison, where Madison basically says, gives this two kingdoms doctrine.
Yeah.
And Madison is the one who's famously, it was Danbury Baptist. I think it was a Supreme Court ruling, but or a letter he wrote to Danbury Baptist. I can't remember all these documents, but who said he did not use the term a wall of separation. He used the term distinction.
Yeah.
That there's a distinction between the two realms in the way of Luther, but the wall of separation came later through Supreme Court rulings. And there's not a wall. I mean, we have a foot in both kingdoms, right?
I was gonna say, if it's a wall, it's got a lot of holes in it. It's not a very good wall.
Yeah, it's not very. It's pretty porous. Yeah, it's pretty porous, right? Because we're citizens of the kingdom of God by faith, right? And we're citizens of this earth by birth. And you're both.
Right.
You're not gonna jump out of the world to be in the church, and you're not gonna leave the church in order to be in the world. Yeah. You're always living in both places. That's why I mentioned earlier in the show that like church governance, the way that we behave in the church, is a secular thing.
Right.
It's not commanded by God. There's not a church governance that's commanded by God. That's a whole nother topic, but yeah.
For good reason, though. I think.
Right. Yeah, because if it were by law, then we'd revolt against it, and there'd be
a theocracy, and then
exactly. Yeah.
We have those around the world today. There's a couple of those theocracies running loose.
We just call it a caliphate and be done with it.
A caliphate. There you go. Yeah. I don't know if you'd say that's been successful for a lot of people that are occupying that area, but
no.
I don't know. I think it's a conversation that needs to be had a lot more, in my opinion, because we've let it slip for a long time. I notice it the most amongst the boomers in my congregation.
Yep. God and country.
Yeah, exactly. God and country.
It's all blended.
Gen Xers were so anti-institution because we're post-Vietnam. Anti.
Yeah, we rejected both institutions.
Yeah, exactly. We rejected the church and the state simultaneously. Shout out to the punk rock crowd. But yeah, I think it's almost incumbent upon us to go back and take responsibility now for what we essentially kind of tore up, or at least neglected. Let's say neglected.
I think
we neglected it. It was always there. I've always been aware with it, but at least the last 5 or 6 years, I've certainly become acutely aware of the need in my ministry,
right,
to think more deeply on the subject and to refer to people who are much more knowledgeable than I am on this topic, and go, hey, fill me in.
Yeah. Well, for everything, there's a time and a season where you're going to have a specific focus. On the other hand, I would say it's probably worth considering, like, what are the essential, what are our core doctrines? What is it that we believe? And then read through those on a regular cycle, maybe not yearly, like we might with the catechism, small catechism, but maybe something like the Augsburg Confession you do every 5 to 10 years, and you go through it again, and you work through those foundational documents that do outline, like this doctrine, is in our Lutheran confessions. that way, like at least once or twice or 3 times in a generation, you get it,
Yeah,
intensively taught
absolutely.
again, so
Mhm.
that you can hold on to it. Because
Yeah.
I mean, we've learned this lesson the hard way through a lot of pain and suffering and actual
Mhm.
death,
Mhm.
right? And people died because they couldn't make this distinction, or because they
People
needed
died in
to
the last
uphold
8
the
months that I
distinction.
know. Well, people that I know that I know who have died the last 8 months is
That's true.
because it wasn't taught and they couldn't hold it. They
Hmm.
didn't know it. They
Right.
fell one way or the other, but it didn't matter whether it was their guilt before God or their guilt in relation to their neighbor.
Yeah. They either left
Drove
the
them to kill
church
themselves.
or,
Yeah.
something.
And that's a whole nother issue. But I mean, that's like I talked about with Germany after World War One. That was personal for them. And that's a
Right.
big part of this. And it's personal for me. People, it's
Hmm.
like I'm not arguing out of an ideological position alone. I'm arguing out of a life position where I will never forget what my governor did to essentially facilitate the death of certain people that I know.
Yeah. And God willing, your
Or
children won't
other,
forget either.
exactly. That's the problem, is that my children have to live with this and I have to raise them
Right.
to
But
live
they
in both
need to,
kingdoms.
remember.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. This is what
Because if they
happened
forget,
in
yeah,
2020
exactly.
when it got off the
Yeah,
rails.
right.
And you have to be a bulwark against it,
Hmm. And I don't care whether there's a D or an R and an I in front of your name.
Nope. Nope.
If you do this, you're on the list. And I'm not going to forget it. If you came to me for absolution, I'd forgive you.
Of course.
I'd absolve you of your sin if you repented. But I'm not seeing a lot of repentance thus far. So I pray.
Yeah. I hope that's if not a, next year project, a 5 to 10 year project, that we come to grips with what we did. But we talked about like 9/11 and other
Mhm.
massive global events that we never really
Yeah.
reconciled what happened with what was
No,
done.
because we have amnesia. We're ahistorical.
Hmm.
We're unfortunately for different reasons. We're just custom designed now not to reflect historically on where we're coming from and where we're going.
Lazy.
It is laziness and it's inculcated, it's indoctrinated, I think. And I think it's incumbent upon the church being historical
Hmm.
to be the keeper of that information.
The
So we don't lose
document.
our way as the church of Jesus Christ and the gospel and the gifts, but also simultaneously so that we do not succumb again to culture as the church has done so many times throughout its history. And the chickens certainly came home to roost in the last 8 months for sure.
Yeah. Can you imagine somebody in the distant future listening to the last 8 months of this show and being like, "What was going
Right.
on?"
Yeah.
But that'll be what it'll be like. Like,
Mm-hmm.
we thought we were told one thing happened in
Mm-hmm.
2020, but when we're listening to this show, it sounds like it's something very different.
Right.
God
Yeah.
willing, yeah, maybe it'll serve a benefit to some future generation. I don't know, or it'll be forgotten, like most good, stuff that's done in the church.
I like how you put the word good on the front of that. Like
Oh,
stuff.
I dropped the word good. Yeah, no,
There we go.
just stuff.
So if you have the opportunity, and I have to credit you for bringing this book up and going, hey,
Yeah.
you know this book? I'm like, yeah, I'm staring at it right now. Actually know the guy. Tyranny and Resistance, the Magdeburg Confession and the Lutheran Tradition by David Mark Whitford. I highly recommend it. It's a short read, like I said, about 110 pages, 112 pages. So
Yep.
it's
Linked
got a
in the show
good
notes.
bibliography, really good bibliography. Books used to have those.
Although it has endnotes instead of footnotes.
It does have endnotes.
I
So
don't
A
understand people.
minus. It's an A minus effort. Exactly. Just, I don't know. Do something else. Just please I just
It's
need them at the bottom.
available on paperback and Kindle.
Oh, nice.
Yep.
Perfect. So check it out. And thank you again, as always, for listening. It's important that you voted, but ultimately your vote doesn't matter because Jesus is coming.
So true. So true.
That is our hope and our consolation in times of trial and in times of anxiety and fear.
Absolutely.
So stand fast. Jesus is still risen. We'll talk to you soon. Peace.